Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 5, Organism and Nervous System, and this is part 2 of lecture 5. In this part, we will look at memories in the context of the organism, how we define them, where we can find them, how we define the organism identity, and then we will consider the nervous system, in particular as the information subsystem of the organism, and we'll look at identity violations and adaptations in response to these in the organism and the nervous system. And finally, we will consider the complexity of the organisms. Now, in the previous part, we looked at multicell organisms, and we said that the cells are the communication units. We focus on the cells from an outside perspective. We don't look at what's inside of the cell. And we said that the interactions of cells constitute the communications. And we look at regularities of these interactions between cells, which define the continuation and referencing rules in the context of the organism. And we see the organism as the system of these cellular communications that follow the rules of the organism system. We noted that the tissues are specialized cellular communications systems, which are constrained, and they form a subsystem within the organism. Now, as we discussed earlier, in these communication systems that we consider, it is important to have memories if the system is growing and adapting to the environment better. So the question is, where do we find memories in the context of the organism? So memories are really about collecting information about the cell communications. So these cell communications compose the organism, and the representation or memory of these communications are the memories. So these are required to analyze the perceptions of the organism and model the organism and control the actions of the organism. Now, if such memories are there, then referencing these memories facilitates the generation of communications in compliance with the referencing and continuation rules of the organism. So having these memories is beneficial in this sense. Now, if you look at an organism and you look at where they find these kind of monitoring behaviors of cells, where do you find behaviors, actions of interactions between cells that can be seen as memories of what happened in the cell, in the organism? Well, you find two kinds of cells. These are the immune cells and the neurons. The immune cells monitor what communications cell leads in terms of displaying molecules on their cell membrane. While the neurons monitor how the organism, how the cells within the organism behave in kind of general sense. So, for example, they may monitor how muscles stretch, or they may monitor the production of certain molecules by certain cells, or the presence of molecules, concentrations of molecules in certain environments, and so on, which are all representations of how the cells communicate with each other. So, looking at the immune cells check, we said, what's on the surface of the cells, effectively how the cells behave, how they identify themselves. So these immune cells check if a cell produces the wrong kind of communication. So, for example, diseased cells or cells which are infected by viruses uh, do not conform with the expected behaviors of the cells. They may generate the wrong kind of molecules displayed on the cell membrane. Or in other ways, they may behave differently from how normal cells are expected to behave. Now, these differences, in particular, in terms of release of molecules and display of molecules on the cell membrane, are detected by the immune cells. And these immune cells, in this sense, monitor the validity of these communications generated by the cell. When wrong communications are detected, the immune cells aim to enforce the organism's identity by eliminating the cells that do not fit the rules. So they effectively kill these cells or induce cell deaths in these cells. If you look at the neurons monitor the intercellular communications, as briefly we noticed. So what happens through the interactions between the cells that impact the environment of the cells within the organism, and these impacts on the organism are monitored by the neurons. So, as I mentioned, stretch receptor neurons measure or monitor the stretching of muscle cells, or neurons which sense the presence of certain molecules and the concentration of these molecules, like carbon dioxide or oxygen concentration in the blood, or the presence of acid inside of the stomach or among in the intercellular tissue. So these neurons have special sensing components which can sense these changes, and in this way they monitor what happens in the organism in terms of the impact of the intercellular communications on the organism. Similarly, the neurons can also trigger the right kind of behaviors of organisms, the right kind of behavior of cells, where, for example, a neuron may release neurotransmitters onto muscles and triggers the contraction or relaxation of the muscle. Or similarly, they may release appropriate molecules on other cells, triggering the release of certain molecules into the blood or into the intercellular environment. Overall, these impacts lead to communications between the other cells. Effectively, the neurons monitoring and also helping the reproduction or the creation of system-conformed communications within the organism, such as the generation of movements, for example. So, we define the information subsystem of the organism using these two kinds of cells and the communications between them. So, immune system, from this perspective, constitutes a component of the information subsystem which deals with the checking and enforcement of identity communications in the organism. Because they check that the cells display the valid molecules on their surface, and if this is not the case, then they enforce the identity of the organism by aiming to eliminate these cells. The main part of the information subsystem in multicellular organism is formed by the nervous system, where in the organism where this nervous system does exist, in the sense that the nervous system senses what happens in the organism, what are the impacts of the intercellular communications, processes this information, and derives neural communications towards other cells which trigger behaviors in the organism and trigger the interactions between the cells of the organism. Now, in this context, the neural system also checks that the right kind of communications happen within the organism, between the cells of the organism. And if this is not the case, it can enforce the changes of the interactions between cells to make them conform with the expected behaviors within the organism. Now, the nervous system is organized in various ways in organisms. If you take a simple organism like the cnidarian hydra, what you see there is that neurons are dispersed in their organism. They form a loosely connected network, but they have many interactions with other cells in the organism as well. So there are neurons which sense and control and interact with each other. The amount of communications between neurons and the amount of communications between neurons and non-neurons is not that different. So they do not form a well-separated nervous tissue beyond this loose network of few hundred neurons. In the case of higher organism, there's a much more clear separation of the nervous tissue. The neurons interact very much with other neurons. They are densely packed together and somewhat separated, often by membranes or other structures of the organism, are separated from the rest of the organism. And in these cases, the nervous tissue produces a lot of memory processing, a lot of information processing within the organism, and in processing the perception of the organism and driving the actions of the organism. So, for example, in the insects, there are many ganglia which form the brain of the insect, and possible ganglia are arranged across the body of the insect, which deal which form the nervous system and deal with the neural information processing within the organism. Or in case of humans or other vertebrates, there is a large brain and a spinal cord and a number of ganglia associated with across the organism, which concentrate the neurons and the information processing within the nervous system. So let's have a look at the communications between neurons. What we see there is that the signals are transmitter molecules or ions that are passed on through electric junction molecules. The transmitter molecules are released from presynaptic neurons, and they propagate through the synapse, the synaptic cleft, the space in the sense, to the postsynaptic neuron, where they are picked up by receptors and they make changes in the neuron, as we discussed in an earlier lecture. Now, these trigger further actions of the neuron. So the neurons integrate the signals that come back. Also, they consider the signals that they have generated before, and then they generate their output. The signaling happens either by spikes or graded action potentials, or rather graded potentials. The graded potentials are relatively slow rises of the potential difference from the relaxation potential difference, which is about -7 to -90 millivolts, which is a potential difference between the outside and inside of the neuron. The inside is much more negative, the outside is much more positive. When the neuron generates a graded potential, the potential difference changes, the insight becomes gradually more positive, and then returns to the more negative state at the end. In the case of action potentials or spikes, this change is very rapid. The potential difference between the inside and outside becomes more positive, can be something like plus 20 millivolts, so a lot of positive ions go inside of the cell, and then very suddenly goes back to the relaxation potential of minus 90 millivolts. What you see on the screen are some action potentials where there's a rapid rise followed by a rapid decline of the potential difference. So these are the typical ways of generating communications. These are the communications that you can record on the axon of the neurons. Effectively, they show how the signal is propagated along the axon. And at the end of the axon, at the axonal buttons, the action potentials or the graded potentials trigger the release of neurotransmitter molecules. Depending on how many of these action potentials arrive to the axonal buttons, or how is the graded potential changing, that depends how much volume of these transmitter molecules are released. And this is how neurons pass on communications from one neuron to another neuron. Now, the neurons integrate these incoming signals, and they integrate them in a relatively complex way. A simple model is the integrate and fire neuron, where you simply sum up the incoming excitatory and inhibitory signals. Of course, in real neurons, it doesn't exactly happen in this way. The spatial temporal pattern of the incoming signals matters, and that determines the pattern of the outgoing signals. In some neurons, these outgoing signals are the spikes with some particular temporal spacing between them. In some other neurons, there are series of spikes, bursts of spikes, which are generated and these travel down and release at the end, or trigger the release at the end of the axon buttons of the neurotransmitters. And in other neurons, you have these kind of graded potentials which travel along the axons and depend on what kind of inputs the neuron gets. Now, considering the nervous system, from the perspective of our systems theory, what you see is that there are communications between the neurons. These communications in animals with more organized nervous system are such that they are happening mostly between neurons. And these neural communications, the propagation of signals and the release of neurotransmitters at the end of the propagation and the triggering of further behaviors in the postsynaptic neurons. These are the communications, and these form a communication system where there is a clear frequency or density boundary with many communications happening between neurons and relatively rarely communications happening with the other cells. So here you can see in these animals with well-organized nervous system a clear separation of the nervous system as a communication subsystem within the organism, and this communication subsystem is the one that deals with the information processing within the organism. Now, the actions of the nervous system are impacts on the environment of the nervous system, and in this case, the environment of the nervous system is the organism itself. So, for example, the neurons send signals to the muscles. These signals action potentials travel down to the axon, along the axon to the muscle. There, the axon terminals release the neurotransmitters, which trigger the behavior of muscle cells, for example, the contraction of these muscle cells, and also the propagation of the communications to other muscle cells. So all muscle cells contract and relax in the right pattern that is triggered by the neural signals that are sent from the neurons to the muscles. So in this way, the actions of the nervous system impact how other cells in the organism behave. In other cases, neurons may trigger the release of some molecules, or in other cases, it may trigger other behavior of the cells which are impacted by the neurotransmitters released by the neurons. Now, of course, these actions of the nervous system on the organism may also lead to actions of the organism onto its own environment. So, for example, if the muscles are contracted, then the organism may move a limb, and that will have a mechanical impact on the environment of the organism. Now, looking at the perceptions of the nervous system, so these are changes in the neural communications within the nervous systems, which are triggered by changes in the nervous system's environment, the organism. So, as the behavior of cells in the organism changes and they change their communications, these changes are different. So they lead to communications which are different from the expectations of the nervous system based on previous communications between these cells. And this difference is sensed by the neurons because they generate different communications within the nervous system. So there is a difference perceived, and these are the perceptions. So for example, in the retina, there are the light-sensitive cells, and depending on how much incident light comes into these cells, on that depends how much activity these cells generate in themselves, and on that depends what communications they send to the neurons. Now, these sensory cells send similarly to neurons, and they send neurotransmitter releases to neurons. However, when the incident light amount changes, this behavior of these cells changes. So, for example, if it gets darker, less light, then they may release more neurotransmitter. While if there is much more light, they may become fully silent. And this change in the behavior of these cells is what is triggering a change in the behavior of neurons within the nervous system, because the neurons which sense the communications of these cells send their own communications to other neurons, and their communication depends on what they receive from the photoreceptor cells. So their behavior, their communications within the nervous system will change. And in this way, this change of the behavior of these neurons will be leading to the perceptions of the nervous system. So later, these perceptions are further processed and lead to further memories and representations of perceptions of the nervous system, and then further later they may also lead to further actions triggered by the nervous system. So if you think of, for example, an animal hunting and a prey, let's say a fly appears in the eyesight, in the front of the eyes of a frog, then this changes what are the perceptions of the frog, what are perceptions of the nervous system about the eye of the frog. and that will trigger, after many interactions between neurons, which happen relatively fast, the hunting behavior in the frog, which will involve many muscles moving the body of the animals, aiming to try to catch the frog and the fly and eat it. So, moving on to how we see the nervous system as a system of communications. What we can see is that the rules of the nervous system, the continuation and referencing rules, can be expressed in terms of conditional rules relative to spatial-temporal patterns of neural signals. So we have these interactions between the neurons. The spatial-temporal pattern of these determines what communications a neuron is generated. And these are the referencing and continuation rules of the nervous system, the rules which tell us how these relationships work. Now, in the case of the neurons, we have a lot of experimental data, and in some cases, we know sufficiently clearly how changes in the inputs of a neuron lead to changes in the output. So, for example, in the case of sensory neurons, let's say stress sensing neurons, which sense the muscle movements, more stimulation, more stretching, leads to higher frequency of generation of action potentials. And there is a quite straightforward translation of the signal intensity to a change in the pattern of communications generated by the neuron. In the case of neurons which are in more complex part of the nervous system, in particular in the brain, these kind of rules are much more complex, and unfortunately we just don't have enough data yet to really understand the details of it. However, what is clear from various experimental works is that the spatial-temporal pattern of the incoming signals matters. For example, in the visual brain, in the visual cortex, there are neurons which have preferential sensitivity to certain kind of patterns in the visual space. So, for example, certain orientations of bars and certain spatial frequency of the light and dark touches, how they follow each other, may trigger the most strongest action from particular neuron. However, what has been shown is that these neurons receive input from a variety of other neurons, some being sensitive for the same kind of patterns, some being sensitive for other kinds of patterns. So it is much less clear how this integration happens at these higher neurons. Very recently, it has been also shown that the specificity of neurons relative to the incoming signals changes over time. And although across many neurons the signal can be read out reliably, meaning that we can determine what is the input based on the analysis of the neural signals across multiple neurons. However, at the level of single neurons, it has been shown that this is changing. So, what we can tell on the basis of that is that when in simple cases we can establish these conditional rules which link the inputs to the outputs of the neurons, but at the same time, in the case of much more complex neurons which are in the brain, these relationships are much more complex, and we are just really at the beginning of understanding how these may work. But certainly there are patterns. It is very clear that what a neuron generates as an output depends on what input they get. The exact ways of how this dependence work is not that clear in the complex situations in the brain, but clearly it depends on what input these neurons get. So these rules which connect The inputs to the outputs of neurons constitute the referencing and continuation rules of the nervous system. Now, the meaningful communications in nervous systems are the ones which follow these rules and reference previous neural communications and provide reference for further neural communications. Now, these communications support the reproduction and extension of the nervous system. Now, these are the normal communications. Now, of course, as I said, given that we don't really know exactly what are the rules, it's difficult to say in practice. However, in principle, we can see that these are the neural communications that are meaningful. Now, the meaningless communications are the communications between neurons which do not fit these rules. So, some communications are plainly wrong. Possibly neurons get diseased or get infected, in which case they produce some output, but that is not the matching output for the input that they receive, or they produce no output at all. In other cases, neurons may follow the rules of how they should produce the outputs, but overall, these communications do not lead to the expected continuations. Now, there can be many reasons for these kind of wrong communications. So, for example, drugs have an impact on the neural communications, and they create communications which do not relate properly to the inputs of these neurons. So, for example, these may lead to false perceptions. Under the impact of drugs, people may see things that are not there, which are effectively generated by triggering communications between neurons, which do not relate closely to the communications that these neurons receive normally. Or, for example, in the case of amputations, people may still feel the pain in the amputated limb. Again, there is no regular trigger of these pain representing signals. However, the neurons interact in ways which generate a false perception in the organism and within the nervous system of the organism in this case. Or consider epileptic seizure. So in this case, many neurons in the brain interact in a synchronous way and supporting their further interaction in the same synchronous way. Typically, these last for short term, but during that short term reproduction of this aberrant communication pattern between the neurons leads to abnormal behavior of the organism, because the neurons participate in a communication, in a set of communications which do not follow the normal rules of communications within the nervous system, and the output that they generate do not fit the normal behaviors of the organism. So in these cases, the neurons, because they don't behave normally, they send the wrong kind of comments to muscle cells and other cells which, for example, release molecules in the body. And the end result is the epileptic behavior of the organism, with the twitching muscles and other symptoms of epilepsy. So what you see in these cases is that while the normal behavior is defined by default as the behavior that causes regular behavior of the organism, and those are the normal communications of the neurons, which are meaningful. The meaningless communications are the ones where we can see through the behavior of the organism that these are wrong neural communications, which either do not fit the lexicon of the neural system, or are erroneous communications which lead to the lack of normal continuations of the communications between the neurons. Now, in the nervous system, you can see a number of subsystems. As we said earlier, the subsystems are generated by constraints on communications. These are the structures of the system. Now, in the nervous system, there are specializations where a subset of neurons specializes on actions and perceptions, or actions or perceptions, which are constrained to a particular range of behaviors of the organism. So, for example, the motor system within the nervous system is composed of neurons which deal with the motor control of the muscles and with the perception of how the muscles and the body moves. So these neurons specialize on this, and they release appropriate neurotransmitters for the muscles, and they follow narrower rules in terms of processing the information about the motor system, about the movement of the muscles within the organism. Or the visual system, again, in fact, it has multiple subsystems within it, which specialize in analyzing and processing certain aspects of the visual information that the organism receives. Or the olfactory system, which specializes in the sensing of molecules in the environment of the organism, and the control of the behavior which depends on these molecules which are in the environment. So, for example, this controls the mating behavior when pheromones are present in the environment, in the air or the water around the organism. The pheromones trigger the appropriate behavior through olfactory system, which induces further behaviors in the organism through motor system and other parts of the nervous system, which lead to the mating behavior of the organism, for example. But similarly, olfactory system also works in the triggering of defensive behaviors, where the appropriate sensing of olfactory signals, molecules in the air or water, indicates the presence of predators or danger, and in such cases the organism triggers its defensive or escape behavior. Now, what's important here is that these subsystems follow their specific rules. They have specific constraints on their communications, and they have specific structures. So, for example, the olfactory system in the vertebrates is organized in olfactory bulbs and related higher nervous cortical structures. The visual system, again, it's organized in particular light-sensitive structures like the eyes, and a number of higher centers which process visual information in complex ways and with increasingly abstract ways. Now, the separation of these subsystems is perhaps not always that strict. Clearly, there are interactions between the neurons in them. However, given that they follow different rules and different patterns of communications, you can see the separation in terms of communication rules of these subsystems. Now, the reproduction and expansion of the nervous system is a question. So we said earlier that all systems aim to reproduce and expand. So the same applies to the nervous system, that the nervous system aims to reproduce itself and also to expand itself in the sense of building up more information about the organism and implicitly about the organism's environment as well, and to rely on this buildup of information to generate better behaviors in the organism. Now, just notice that if a neuron does not receive the input from other neurons, the neurons quite often die because their survival is dependent on receiving the communications from other neurons. As the nervous system works and generates more information about itself, this information is stored in distributed ways through regular communications between the neurons. And this is how the nervous system maintains it and effectively grows by gaining more experience and building more memories of these experiences. The actual ways of this are still unclear. To some extent, there is experimental evidence which shows how the memories are established. Clearly, we understand certain parts of the brain in various animals are critical for memories, certain ways, certain kind of neurons, and certain ways of communications between neurons are key. However, the details of this are not fully understood yet. However, it is very clear that the interactions between neurons represent the information that the organism about the experiences of the organism, and these informations are referenced when the organism generates behaviors. All right, so let's move to consideration of identity violations and adaptations. First, let's see identity violations. So these are the 40 behaviors. At the scale of the organism, these are intercellular communications which do not follow the rules. So as we mentioned, the cancer, in the case of cancer, the cancer cells do not follow the rules of the organism, which would imply them not to multiply and to limit their growth, and they generate communications between them that do not fit fully the organism's communications. To some extent, they do fit the organism's communications, so it's but not fully. So, for example, some cancer cells can become mobile and they can establish themselves in other parts of the organism. So they communicate sufficiently to embed in another part of the organism and interact with the cells sufficiently that they can reside there. They can also provide sufficient behaviors and communications to avoid the impact of immune cells quite often. So in that way, the cancer cells retain some ability to follow the organism's rules of communications, but at the same time also have their own communications which do not follow the organism, so deviate from the organism communication rules. As I mentioned, phantom pain is another case where wrong intercellular communications happen, in this case among neurons, and that phantom pain leads to a sensation of pain, which relates to a non-existent limb of the organism. Now, the error situations are, as you noted, the lack of continuation communication. So, for example, if you have toxins which block the neuromuscular junctions, so what this means is that the neurons release the neurotransmitters, but the muscle cells do not respond because their receptors are blocked. Now, what this means is that the muscles do not respond to the neural signal. So, for example, the muscles don't move, and the organism cannot take in air and cannot release the used air from their lungs, and ultimately the organism gets asphyxiated because the muscles don't move. In this case, the expectation would be that following the neural communications or release of neurotransmitters to the muscles would be moving, but this is not happening because of the presence of the toxins. Finally, the failure is when the faults and errors happen frequently, and that leads to shrinking of the organism. So, for example, in neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer or Parkinson's disease, the communications between neurons do not follow the proper patterns. For example, in Alzheimer, the memories get lost or can get the recall of memories becomes very difficult. So clear the communication patterns between the neurons which would manage these memories, the information from the past, do not work any longer well. Of course, we do not understand exactly how that works, why does it happen, and what are the mechanisms, but clearly this is the symptom of these diseases. Or in the case of infections, again, the infections interfere with the communications between the cells. They lead to wrong communications, which trigger further wrong communications between the cells within the organism and may lead to the death of the organism if the infection spreads and becomes permanent and dominant within the organism. Now, of course, the identity violations also trigger adaptations of the organism. For example, if there is a lack of food around the C. elegans worm, this changes the perception of the worm about its environment, while previously they could hunt for bacteria. If the environment is depleted of food, they sense that because they get hungrier, and the hunger is sensed by the nervous system, which is the lack of nutrients in the body, in the blood of the organism. This sensing of the lack of food, lack of nutrients inside of the body leads to a change in the behavior of the organism, and this change in the behavior will mean that the swimming pattern of the worm changes and it swims away from the current location, aiming to find food somewhere else. So the organism adapts to the perception of the lack of food, which triggers the lack of continuation of expected communications between the cells. And in response to this identity violation within the organism and within the nervous system of the organism, there is an adaptation of the behavior, new actions are generated, and the worm finds food somewhere else. Now, at the level of the nervous system, the adaptations take the form of changing interactions and connections between neurons. As you mentioned briefly, the neurons have their axons, which connect to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neurons, and there are the synapses, where the axon terminal buttons connect to the dendrites. Now, these synapses may grow and may shrink. And through this shrinking and growing dynamic process of the synapses, some connections are relaxed and may disappear, and other connections get strengthened, and possibly further connections grow between neurons. And this kind of reorganization of connectivity between neurons happens regularly and frequently across the whole lifetime of the organism. So, for example, there have been experiments rather long time ago about kittens where their eyes were closed immediately after birth. And what has been shown is that the neurons, which normally would process visual information, switched to process auditory information, because that was the information that was available for the brain. And these neurons, given that they were looking for some useful and meaningful input from other neurons, they adapted and they changed their connectivity pattern such that now they process auditory information. Finally, let's look at the complexity of the nervous system and the organisms. In the case of the nervous system, what matters is the amount of communication, how much communication between neurons happens, and clearly larger nervous systems mean more complex nervous system, more complex behavior of the organism. These larger nervous systems typically have more subsystems, and again, more subsystems within the nervous system in general imply more complex behavior generated by the organism, and more complex behavior controlled by an appropriately complex nervous system. If the nervous system is more complex, it can generate better, more complex and more fitting description of the organism, which is the environment of the nervous system, and implicitly that's also more complex and better fitting description of the environment of the organism. So the organism can fit better into that environment, can be more efficient in its reproduction and self-maintenance. So if an organism doesn't have a nervous system, these are low complexity organisms, their range of behaviors is lower and more reduced, while complex nervous systems imply a higher complexity behavioral range. So for example, if you look at plants, they do have a range of behaviors. However, the range of behaviors of plants is much more reduced compared to the range of behaviors of complex animals, which are able to move around and which are able to find resources in a more active way than plants can do that. Although we note here the plants which can hunt, these plants which can capture small insects and digest them. So clearly there is some range of complexity among plant behavior as well. So finally, to summarize, in this part of the lecture 5, we looked at memories in the organism and definition of identity. We said that memories are and identity are defined and processed by the immune cells and the nervous system. We discussed briefly about the immune cells, and we said that those define the identity of the cellular communications, checking what kind of molecules the cells display on their cell membrane. And these are the cells which also enforce identity by killing the cells which display the wrong kind of molecules. In a wider sense, the information subsystem of the organism is mainly constituted by the nervous system, which again defines the identity of the organism in the sense of the right kind of interactions, communications between the cells, monitors these communications between the cells and the impact of these onto the organism, and based on what it is monitoring, it also triggers behaviors of cells within the organism which conform with the expectations of the organism. So we discussed about the system of neurons, and we said that this constitutes the information subsystem, and it is made of the communications between the neurons, which must follow the right rules. And we said that in general, the inputs of the neurons determine what is the output of the neuron, and in this way the communications from presynaptic neurons to the neuron determine the output communications of the neurons, and these are the relationships which define the referencing and continuation rules within the nervous system. We also noted that in simple cases we can establish relatively clearly how are these input-output relationships between the communications of neurons. Although in more complex cases, like in the case of neurons in the brain, these rules are so far too complex for the currently available experimental data to establish them very clearly. We also noted that nervous system may have subsystems which are specialist parts of the nervous system which deal with only some kind of information, for example, olfactory information or visual information. And finally, we discussed about the complexity of the nervous system and of the organism. We said that larger nervous systems which communicate more are more complex, and those which have more subsystems are also more complex than those which do not have subsystems. And in general, the more complex nervous system can give a better representation of the organism, better information processing about the organism, which leads to a better representation of the organism's environment as well in an implicit sense, and better fitting of the organism to its environment. So more complex nervous system increases the complexity of the organism as well. And in general, what we said is that the range of behaviors of organisms without nervous system is generally smaller than the range of behaviors of organisms with nervous system, and in particular the range of behavior of organisms with complex nervous system. Now, let's see a few questions. Is it true that the letters of the neural communication language in higher nervous systems are the spikes, the action potentials, while the words of the communications are spatial-temporal patterns of such spikes? And well, yes, what we said is that in this interpretation of the nervous system, the communication language of the nervous system is made of the communications that are generated between neurons, which are represented by spikes and or action potentials in the case of complex neurons in higher animals. And if you like, an interpretation of this is that the letters might be the individual spikes, while the words, the equivalent of the words, are the patterns of these spikes, where the temporal pattern or the spatial pattern of incoming spikes might constitute these words of the communications. Second question, is it true that the perceptions of the nervous system are about the environment of the organism? Well, the answer to this is no, because the nervous system senses what happens within the organism. So it is sensing what happens within the organism, and environment of the nervous system is the organism itself. The organism's environment is outside of the organism. It does impact on what happens within the organism, and in this sense the nervous system indirectly senses the environment and perceives the environment, but this is an indirect perception. So the answer to the question is no. Third question, is it true that the nervous system describes the environment of the organism? And again, the answer is no, it does describe the organism itself, and implicitly it does describe the environment. So for example, in the case of the visual system, what we see is what our nervous system perceives about the changes in the behaviors of the photosensitive cells, the photoreceptors in our eyes. The environment impacts on these photoreceptor cells, and that impact changes their behavior. What the nervous system senses is the change in the behavior of these cells. And this is why, for example, under the impact of drugs, the neurons interact in ways that are abnormal, but these interactions at higher levels are not seen as abnormal, because at that level the neurons see what previous neurons produce for them, which follows the pattern and the rules of the patterns that are expected to be produced. So the nervous system produces hallucinations in the organism, which clearly are not in the environment. So what this shows is that the nervous system, it really describes the organism itself, and only implicitly and indirectly the environment of the organism. And if the link between the two gets broken, then the nervous system's representation is no longer the representation of the environment, but only of the organism. Next question. Is it true that the nervous system has subsystems? And the answer is that although not all nervous systems have subsystems, at least some nervous systems of more complex animals do have subsystems, like the olfactory system, which deals with olfactive stimuli, the smells, the presence of molecules in air or the water around the organism, or the visual nervous system, which deals with neural communications about the visual, the environment of the organism, which depends on what kind of light input the organism gets. Finally, is it true that organisms without nervous system can have the same complexity as organisms with nervous systems? And the answer to this is no. As we said, the presence of nervous system is really important to generate a complex behavior, but organisms without nervous systems can grow very large and can survive for a long time. In general, organisms with nervous systems have much more adaptive behaviors, can deal with much more variable and much more complex environmental challenges than organisms without nervous system. Thank you.